From Argosy magazine, November 1971, Atlantis, the legend is becoming fact. Recent discoveries on the seafloor off Bimini and Andros Islands, ancient buildings, upright columns, gigantic stone steps, a submerged highway, marble sculpture, and many other finds offer convincing new evidence of an incredible lost civilization which sank in the Atlantic 12,000 years ago. Written by Robert Marks, who was then Argosy Marine Archaeological Editor. Since my last report in Argosy, December 1969, the ancient remains of a lost civilization have begun mushrooming from the Caribbean seafloor at such a rate that it is almost as if a sunken continent were on the rise once more. More than a dozen stone buildings have been discovered on the ocean floor, one of which seems to be a large pyramid. A gigantic stone causeway of unknown length, plus great stone walls thousands of feet long, have been uncovered by the shifting sands. Hundreds of wheel-like stones, 2 or 5 feet in diameter, with holes in the centers, have been found by divers, along with marble carvings, statuary, and an ancient ceramic face of a man, all near the islands of Bimini and Andros, and all exciting new evidence of a prehistoric continent which sank in the Atlantic about 12,000 years ago. Before examining these recent finds in more detail, perhaps some earlier discoveries of importance should be reviewed to give the readers an accurate picture of the case supporting the Atlantis theory. During the summer of 1956, a father and son spearfishing in the Caribbean off Bimini at a depth of 65 feet reported discovering a series of large decorative marble columns of beautiful workmanship standing upright and protruding from the sandy bottom. The shifting sands apparently covered them over, for subsequent efforts to locate them were unsuccessful. However, about a quarter of a mile from this area, Dr. William Bell of Marion, North Carolina, reported 2 years later that he had found a 6-foot column or spire protruding from a double circular gear-like base embedded in the ocean floor. And before it, too, was covered over again, the doctor managed to photograph the object. In August of 1964, an even more startling discovery was made by 2 French naval officers, Captain George Haut and Lieutenant Gerard de Fourberville. While diving in the research submarine Archimedes at a depth of 5 miles off the north coast of Puerto Rico, they reported finding a gigantic stairway hewn from solid rock on a sloping seafloor and obviously man-made. According to the Dictionary of Anthropology, Atlantis is a hypothetical land of the Atlantic Ocean where civilization was alleged to have begun. The existence of Troy, the legends of Sinote, and the tale of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table were also thought to be purely hypothetical until recent archaeological evidence proved them otherwise. Less than a year ago, an eminent scientist from Scripps Institute of Oceanography publicly declared, "The crust of the Caribbean seafloor is unique and it has puzzled scientists for many years. It is not that of a typical ocean basin, but intermediate between oceanic and continental crust, simulating speculation that the Caribbean Sea is a subsided continental block." In 1969, Duke University undertook an oceanographic expedition to study the seafloor of the Caribbean, and they made valuable discoveries which have a distinct bearing on the sunken continent theory. Along the Aves Ridge, an underwater mountain chain running between the Virgin Islands and Venezuela, they brought up more than 50 samples of granite rock, a kind of igneous rock classified as a continental type, found only on the continents or where continents have once been. Around 12,000 years ago, the time in history which Plato gives for the disappearance of Atlantis, modern science has proved that this sea was about 500 feet lower, and that a tremendous rise in sea level occurred. It may have been caused by the melting of the last European glaciers. There is a great deal of evidence that some important natural phenomenon occurred during this period. Under Mexico City, archaeologists have discovered traces of a flourishing culture which came to an abrupt end 12,000 years ago. On the shores of Lake Titicaca, at an altitude of 13,000 feet, we have the inexplicable ruins of Tijuanaco, a massive city built of stone blocks, some weighing as much as 200 tons. This city was suddenly and totally abandoned 12,000 years ago. And during the past few years, There has been much speculation and controversy over the possibility of Atlantis being situated in the vicinity of Andros and Bimini Islands in the Bahamas. Two men particularly responsible for this speculation are Edgar Cayce and Dmitry Rybakov. Back in 1933, Edgar Cayce, the psychic researcher and clairvoyant, made the startling prophecy that in 1968 or 1969, the remains of Atlantis would rise from the sea in or near Bimini. And due to the fact that the Gulf Stream passes very close to Bimini at a speed of 3 or 4 knots, the sand on the seafloor is moved around a great deal, continually covering and uncovering objects. Could Atlantis be said to have risen if the sands of the sea floor simply moved away, revealing what had been covered for thousands of years? Then in 1967, while flying over the Grand Bahama Bank between Bimini and Andros Islands, the well-known underwater explorer Dmitry Rybakov sighted a rectangular object about a quarter of a mile long at a depth of about 13 fathoms, or 18 feet. This, from his more than 2 decades of archaeological experience, he was able to identify as man-made. Was it the wall of an ancient settlement? Unfortunately, when he returned to photograph the strange object, sifting sand had already covered it. On subsequent flights over the area, however, Rybakov, together with Dr. J. Mason Valentine, archaeologist and honorary curator of the Science Museum in Miami, noted other suspicious bottom patterns which lack of time and funds prevented them from investigating further. Then during the summer of 1968, Robert Brush, a pilot flying between Miami and Nassau, reported sighting a sunken square structure in shallow water off the northern tip of the Andros Island, not far from where Rybakov had made his original sighting of the large rectangular object. He passed this information on to Rybakov and Valentine, but before they could investigate the site, the press learned of it and stories appeared reporting that a sunken temple of Atlantis had indeed been discovered. Valentine and Rybakov explored the site and discovered that the structure was definitely man-made, that it measured 60 by 100 feet with walls 3 feet thick, and that the limestone blocks of which the walls were made were laid with an accuracy not to be expected of recent inhabitants of the area, nor of the Lycaean Indians who lived there when Columbus first landed. The Indians were not stone builders. Within a mile of the structure, Valentine and Rybakov found 2 other submerged buildings, one 90 by 50 feet and the other 70 feet by 100 feet. And since that time, they and others, including myself, have found 12 different sunken structures in the same general area. Having dived on several of them, I am certain that they once served as living quarters for men. And on September 2nd, 1968, while searching for other submerged sites off Bimini, Valentine and several friends were taken to an area off the north shore of the island by a local fisherman who reported sighting many square stones on the seafloor at a depth of 3 fathoms. Valentine was astonished to find 2 extensive parallel walls consisting of rectangular and polygonal flat stones of varying thickness and sizes, obviously cut by man and accurately aligned to form a convincing structural pattern. Those stones had evidently lain submerged for centuries, for their tops were rounded by weathering, giving them the appearance of large loaves of bread. The walls protruded about 3 feet above the sand bottom and extended for 1,800 feet parallel to the shoreline. Before the walls were covered over by sand several months later, Valentine and Rybakov managed to make a photographic mosaic of them for various scientists to inspect. Most were in agreement that due to their uniform squareness, which does not occur in nature, these monolithic blocks appeared to have been cut by man. Dr. Carl Holm, head geologist of Global Oceanics, stated that there was little doubt that the blocks were man-made. Rather than get caught up in the Atlantis controversy, Valentine and Rybakov had hoped to keep the discovery of the walls a secret. However, news soon spread and they found themselves associated with members of the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Lacking the capital for more intensive explorations around Bimini and Andros, they joined forces with several wealthy Cayce followers and founded MARS, Marine Archaeological Research Society. On Mars-sponsored expedition, during the last week of February 1969, a fisherman took them to another area between the shore of Bimini and the walls, which had already been covered over by sand. In 15 feet of water, they discovered what appeared to be another wall, more than 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. It was constructed of blocks similar to those of the first walls Valentine had discovered. From plant and animal materials they recovered from beneath the massive blocks, tests were made through carbon dating, and these showed that the wall went back between 6,000 and 12,000 years. In July of the same year, several other significant discoveries were made by Count Pino Torello, an amateur archaeologist who was working independently of the Mars group. Seaward of the location of the 1,800-foot walls discovered by Valentine, he found 44 marble columns or pillars, and they formed a perfect circle, as if they were part of a temple or some other enclosure. They were from 3 to 6 feet in diameter and from 3 to 14 feet long, and some were still standing upright. In another area, about a mile south, Torello discovered many other similar marble columns and felt that many more were buried under the sand. And having heard these recent discoveries, I persuaded Argosy to sponsor an expedition to Bimini in August of 1969. I was accompanied by Rybakov and Andy Pruna, an excellent draftsman and photographer. We had no knowledge of Torello's discoveries at that time, and our main objective was to excavate around the smaller wall which Valentine had discovered earlier that year. On our arrival, we were shocked to learn that only 3 weeks before, 2 divers were reported to have found and raised 2 large stone statues and a section of carved column, spiriting them away in a yacht to the States. The Bimini authorities were naturally upset at this and refused us permission to carry out any excavations on the site. In fact, after only 2 days of surveying and photographing the wall, we were informed that we had to stop all diving until we could get permission from the government of Nassau. I did have ample time, however, to determine for myself that the wall was indeed man-made and a very important archaeological site which should be carefully excavated. I convinced both Rybakov and Valentine to break away from the Mars group, which was dominated by Casey psychics, and we decided to work together with a promise of financial aid from an archaeological society. We applied to the Bahamian government for excavation permits. In early November 1970, I was astonished to read in the newspaper that the North Atlantic Rockwell Corporation, which had substantial land holdings on Bimini, had been granted exclusive exploration rights on all underwater ruins in the Bimini area. Rybakov, hearing of this, rushed to Nassau and demanded an explanation, but none was forthcoming, nor would the authorities tell him whether or not they would grant us a permit to explore the sites off Andros Islands. Around this time, 2 other interesting discoveries were made. A Pan Am pilot, who wishes to remain anonymous, informed me that he had discovered still another large wall off Bimini. This one was in 60 feet of water, which had a large archway going through the middle of it. Then, as further proof that some ancient civilization may have existed in the Bahamas, a tourist on Treasure Cay discovered scattered fragments of pottery and the ruins of what seemed to be mud ovens for cooking. Several archaeologists who have visited the site claim that it dates much earlier than the Lucayan Indians. Since my initial involvement with the sites off Andros and Bimini, my interest in Atlantis and other early civilizations has greatly increased. As an archaeologist, my main objective is to identify and date these sites through careful and systematic excavation. From the dealings I have had with representatives of the North American Rockwell Corporation, I gather that they are not eager to prove or disprove the Atlantis theory. Soon after they obtained the lease for the Bimini area, they hired a geologist with previous experience in the area. And after a brief trip to Bimini, during which he didn't even go into the water to inspect the walls or columns, he announced the walls were not man-made and the columns were probably from a shipwreck. Unhappy with his report, the Rockwell people engaged the services of scientists from the Marine Laboratory of the University of Miami. One of these, Dr. John Gifford, a geologist, undertook a very thorough survey of one of the walls and reported that the blocks were something of a geological enigma, and none of the evidence conclusively rules out the possibility of human intervention in their formation. As a result of his encouraging report, the Rockwell people decided to mount a major expedition to uncover one of the walls. With the famous astronaut Edgar Mitchell as expedition leader, about 25 people were invited to participate, including Ribicoff and a number of psychics from the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Until 3 days before the expedition was to begin, I was led to believe that I was to be in charge of the actual excavations of the walls. Then my invitation was unceremoniously withdrawn under the weak pretext that there wasn't room enough on the boat. I discovered, however, that, in fact, the Rockwell people feared that I would publish an unfavorable account, which might not make their stockholders too happy. Fortunately, I was able to interest a good diving friend of mine, Art Hartman, to take me over in his boat while the Rockwell expedition was in progress. Their salvage vessel, the Venture, was anchored over one of the walls where just a month earlier Ribicoff reported sighting 16-foot-high pillars holding up some of the massive 15-ton blocks. We anchored alongside their vessel despite their shrill warnings that we would be arrested for diving in the area which they held exclusive rights to excavate. However, we had already received permission from the Bahamian government to dive on the site, although not to excavate. In any case, nature had already done the excavating, as the bottom was clear of all sand. The wall wasn't a wall at all. The massive stone blocks, which were 3 to 4 feet thick, were resting on the hard sea floor, and if anything, the site resembled a road or causeway very similar to many I have seen in Yucatan and elsewhere in the world. We confronted about the 16-foot-high columns, and he had reported sighting. Ribicoff claimed that he had really seen them on another wall, which unfortunately had been covered over again by sand. The most important information gleaned from this expedition was the fact that none of the blocks was in any way attached to the seafloor, thereby proving that they were not natural formations. Before leaving Bimini, I talked to some old fishermen and asked if they knew of any other underwater walls or ruins around the island. One showed me a bronze coin he claims to have found on the beach, right off the area where most of the walls and columns were found. The coin, which does not necessarily have to be associated with the ruins, was Phoenician and dated from about the 5th century BC. Several weeks ago I made a brief visit to the area off Andros Island, excavating a hole by hand alongside one of the buildings. I dug down more than 7 feet and never did reach the bottom of the wall on the side of the building. And even more important, I found a ceramic face of a man, a carved piece of marble, and more than a dozen ceramic shards, none of which appears to be New World in origin. I have submitted photographs of these artifacts to various experts, and they agree with me. Several suggest that they might be Mediterranean origin, and they definitely date prior to Columbus's alleged discovery of America. Near this submerged structure off Andros, on a small cay, Valentine had reported finding hundreds of wheel-like stones with holes in the center ranging from 2 to 5 feet in diameter. I also visited this cay and verified their existence, and on a reef close by I found several more of these perfectly cut stones buried deep in the coral, indicating that they had been there for a long time. In appearance, they are identical with the stone currency used for centuries by natives of Yap Island in the Pacific. Mystery still surrounds all the discoveries made around Bimini and Andros, but one thing seems certain. If the continent of Atlantis, they were very likely vestiges of some other old world civilization, and when identified, will shed more light on who really first discovered the New World.